giving you the insider takes and the big picture view on the Dawgs. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles with DawgNation insider Mike Griffith and Cody Chaffins.
Happy Tuesday to you, DawgNation. Cody Chaffins and Mike Griffith with you. A day late, hopefully not a dollar short, as we are on the first official day of the college football off-season. Mike?
Yeah, I think we're all ready for last season to be over with. And, of course, it was over with for Georgia on January 1st. And now we're already looking ahead to the way too early looks, Cody. And it seems like the rest of the nation celebrating the downfall of the SEC now, 3 years without an SEC champion.
Yeah, we were going to talk about where Georgia is in these way too early polls. We'll also talk about what Georgia's got to do to kind of live up to those expectations in 2026. We'll wrap up last night's college football national championship game and talk about changes potentially coming to the college football playoff. We'll, of course, hit the Carson Beck and some of the pettiness that's out there with Georgia fans today. We'll also hit a little Dawgs basketball. But before we look ahead to 2026 and what we expect, well, the final poll of this past college football season came out today, Mike, and Georgia comes in sixth behind Ohio State, Oregon, Ole Miss, of course, Miami, and Indiana there. But sixth, does it feel low to you?
It does. Fifth in the coaches poll, but yeah, it does feel low. And, you know, Georgia's had a string of top 5, top 10 finishes. I think they've been in the top 10 every year since, Cody, I want to say 2017. But yeah, it does feel low when you consider that they were the number 3 national seed and arguably should have been the number 2 when you consider that Ohio State did not win the Big Ten title game. Kind of understand it. Is Georgia slipping a little bit in that terms of national perception? Well, they are 1 year further removed away from the national championship game, and they did lose to Ole Miss and not make the Final Four. I still think 6 a little low for me, though, Cody. When I take a look at it, I don't like seeing Ohio State ahead of them. I think that's wrong. I think they should have finished ranked ahead of Ohio State. And the way Oregon lost to Indiana, I'm not so sure they're too deserving. Ole Miss at number 3, wow.
Yeah, I mean, they beat Georgia, but Georgia beat everybody on their schedule. That's the thing. And Georgia had the better win of all those teams because they won their conference championship game. So there's something to be said for that. So, yeah, it feels a little low to me. Now, as we look ahead to next year, and 2026 will be the season. The college football national championship will be the 27 national championship. Some of the preseason polls come out. A lot of people like to put them out just so we folks like us can talk about it. Georgia in the On3 preseason poll, I saw him second. CBS Sports, Brandon Marcello had him third. And then some of the odds there, a little bit lower when it comes to the odds. They are 10-1 to be champs next year behind Ohio State, Indiana, Notre Dame, Texas, and Oregon. Just some of the numbers I saw. Mike, how do you feel about where Georgia sits right back up there again?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Georgia'd be a bad bet at those odds, but, you know, let's face it, they haven't won a national championship since Todd Monken was here. And I'm trying to think, was Dan Lanning here in 2022? Maybe not. Maybe Schumann. Maybe that was Schumann's first year, but Muschamp was here, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I understand why people doubt Georgia. They bring back the bulk of their defense, and I think they have the best secondary in the country, and they bring Gunnar Stockton back, and I guess that's a good thing. But there are a lot of questions at the receiver position, and you know, Cody, talking to the Senior Bowl scouts and people that watch this game closely, Georgia's receivers this year weren't great shakes, and I know it's not popular to say these things, but let's speak truthfully. You know, Colby Young really wasn't a dynamic receiver at all, and neither was Noah Thomas. I mean, they played well at times, but talking to the people that watched the film, Oscar Delp as well, these guys weren't getting separation. It was not easy for Gunnar Stockton to make these throws because his guys were being covered. That's why they're not going to be drafted on the first or the second day of the NFL draft. It's why they're not in the Senior Bowl. They're not elite. There's no George Pickens. There's no Ladd McConkey. There's no Brock Bowers. Gunnar didn't have those targets available to him. And so now you're going to need to see Talon Taylor and C.J. Wiley, these guys step up. Or, you know, we've seen Canyon coming in from Georgia Tech. You got to have some receivers, man. You got to have some playmakers. I mean, look at Miami and that freshman receiver. What a difference he made, right? I guess that was their Zachariah Branch. I mean, that's one guy that Gunnar had to throw to, and everybody in the stadium knew that he was looking for him on every play.
Yeah, I think Georgia would definitely take a Malachi Tony, no doubt about it. And you talk about the receivers. Georgia's replacing 6 of the top 7 pass catchers from a year ago. So even if a group that wasn't that great, now you've got more unproven folks. So it's going to be an interesting offseason to talk about that. But you talked about a little bit of the comparison with Miami, and that's one of those things I wanted to dive into a little bit in this show, since Georgia's expected to be right up there as a contender again next season. What's going to put them over the top? So I just kind of wanted to put, apples to apples. Look at Georgia compared to Indiana this year or Miami. These are teams that got there, right? Did they feel different? And I was watching the national championship last night, and there was just a different feel when you were watching. I said, oh, that's something I hadn't seen all year because I watched all the Georgia games. It just felt different, and I think for me, first and foremost, where it felt different, Mike, was that defensive line of scrimmage. Both of those teams, Georgia used to have the havoc rate, right? They used to talk about that. There was havoc on every play thanks to the defensive lines of both of those teams.
Yeah, I think specifically an edge rusher is what you're talking about there, Cody. And let's face it, losing Damon Wilson hurt, and they weren't able to replace him. The transfer from Army didn't work out. He's already marched off to another school, and I know he played hard and tried, but he wasn't dynamic. And that first portal window closed by the time Damon Wilson announced he was leaving for Missouri. So Georgia was lacking an elite edge rusher, and then at that, Gabe Harris gets injured and doesn't play against Ole Miss. You can't help but wonder if he could have made a difference against Ole Miss the way Chambliss was able to buy extra time. So not your typical depth there. I mean, there was a time when, my goodness, you had the future ACC Defensive Player of the Year as a backup at defensive end. He had to transfer out to start at Florida State, right?
Right.
So, there was just an embarrassment of talent at the speed rush edge, and you just don't have that at Georgia. And so to your point, that was really missing from Georgia this year, and I think it really did. I don't want to say hurt the defense, but it didn't help the defense. What did they have, Cody? 7 sacks through 7 games?
Right. It's not very high. So because I had the feeling, I was like, oh, this feels different. Let me look at the numbers and see what bears out. So here's a little research we did today. Tackles for a loss, Indiana 3rd in the nation, and tackles for loss per game, because we had to break it down. They played 16. Not everybody played 16 games. So they had 8 tackles for loss per game. Georgia 122nd in the nation with just 4.21 tackles for loss per game. Now, a lot of folks will tell you that's the way Kirby Smart plays defense. He wants his guys on the line of scrimmage, filling gaps, and that's fine. But in 2022, they were at least better. So this year it was 4.2 tackles for loss per game. 2022 it was 6, and it was 6.71 in 2021. Same thing with sacks. Miami and Indiana, they were tops in the nation in sacks, but again, they played 16 games. So if you just do it per game, they were 4th and 11th. So still right up there in the top of the nation. Georgia 117th in sacks per game with just 1.43. And again, sacks aren't always a part of this Kirby Smart defense, and they've been successful, but they were higher in those national championship years. 49th in 22, and they were 6th in 2021 in sacks per game. So those are a couple stats right there, yeah, where the numbers do bear it out. Georgia was different than the 2 teams that played for a national title.
Oh, no doubt. And when you're not getting pressure, you're not getting interceptions. I think Ellis Robinson, the 4th, had 4 of Georgia's 9 interceptions, redshirt freshmen. So they didn't really have the turnovers that they wanted to produce. They weren't operating with the same field position. I always listen. It sounds like I'm taking away from Stetson Bennett when I say these things, but I'm really not. I'm just pointing out that he had an elite defense that was getting him field position, that was getting him 3rd down stops, that was giving him a margin for error when he struggled, like Gunner did at times last year. Because they didn't have that elite defense, they had to come from behind in 6 of their 7 SEC wins. 21 and 22. They weren't falling behind, Cody. Bryce Young in the national title game, he didn't get in the end zone until late in the 3rd quarter versus the current Alabama now and what we saw in the first game. So I do think the defense is going to pick up, though. I like the transfer from Auburn. I think that gives them a chance. I like who's coming back on the defensive front. I think they're going to be good. I think the linebacking core will not drop off. Looking for big things from Chris Cole and Justin Williams, as well as Raylan Wilson. And I think they may have the best secondary in the country. But again, it starts up front. I think you made a great point about the Georgia defensive line. They were better than they've been the last 2 years, but they were not at the championship level they were in 21 and 22.
Yeah, it is the old cliche, and defense wins championships. In Georgia, in the championship game, at least in the SEC, the defense showed up. Georgia gets the win over Alabama, but then, and partly, like you said, there was a lot of folks missing on that defense against Ole Miss, but Ole Miss went up and down the field, and your defense fell short, and that's part of the reason you fell short. So, yeah, the big question for me on the defensive line is you look at the guys who are coming back, and you'll have Gabe Harris back. That's huge because he was a game wrecker in the second half of the season. Now his stats, because the first half didn't equal the second half, but he was definitely coming on. I think for me, has earned that game wrecker status where teams are going to say, all right, we're sending 2 his way, make sure he is blocked. Quintravious Johnson definitely took steps forward this year. But on the interior of the defensive line, I'm excited to see the jump that a guy like Elijah Griffin can make, a former 5-star. He's played a little bit this year, ended up with 1 sack, and he got a lot of experience. Can he take that next step, that jump from freshman to sophomore? I feel like a guy like that, because you look at, Ruben Bain and Mesidor and some of those guys on that defensive line for Miami, those guys are juniors, but, been in the system. At least Bain has been in Miami the entire time, has grown up to those numbers. So I'd be interested to see how Griffin grows up. Can he be that kind of game wrecker that Georgia needs?
Well, everything you've heard about him is that he works really hard, and it was him that forced the fumble on Quan Lacey in the game against Ole Miss. So by the end of the year, he was making plays, but there's no doubt that a full off season of conditioning, working out with the team, another spring, and you need him to be a ringleader. Now, is he Jalen Carter? I don't know. I don't know how many Jalen Carters you're going to see here, maybe once every 10 years. Is he Jordan Davis? Another first-round pick. Is he a first-round talent? Yes. Can he stay healthy and continue to develop? I mean, that's the hope. I wonder about Xavier McLeod. That's another guy now that's 3 years in the system, another talented person. We talk about Jordan Hall. I mean, they've got some dudes. They've got some experience. But, being Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse isn't enough. Those guys are NFL. Those guys are playing in the NFL, Cody. So I don't say that lightly. But to win championships, you need to be elite up front. And Georgia has not been elite up front since the 2022 season on defense.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. I think about a guy like Jalen Carter, and he comes from Apopka, Florida, which is granted closer to Orlando. But if Miami is back doing what they're doing, it's going to be much harder to start grabbing guys out of Fort Lauderdale or out of the middle of the state of Florida and bringing them up here. Or you're going to have to pay a lot more, because I think that becomes a much more attractive option maybe than it has been.
Yeah, Georgia really bet on their freshman class last year. There was kind of a strategy employed, when we thought there was going to be this $20.5 million cap. Well, that's gone up in smoke now, because now you're seeing that these other NIL deals can indeed involve university-related entities. So it's almost like they threw a rule out there. Georgia tried to make the most of that rule, that $20.5 million cap, and now they're saying, just kidding. There's not really a cap. Now, would Kirby Smart have approached it a different way? I don't know. He can only operate under the rules that they give him, or what we expected to come out of House versus NCAA. In hindsight, I think you probably wish Georgia would have been a little bit more aggressive in the portal. And we can play the what if game, Cody. We can say, what if Fernando Mendoza had chosen Georgia over Indiana? That's not to say Gunnar Stockton didn't do a good job, but does Fernando Mendoza quarterback Georgia to a national championship? I think it's fair to wonder. Let's just throw even more, logs on the fire. If Carson Beck stays, is Georgia playing for the national title? I mean, he did get Miami there. And again, I think Gunnar Stockton did a great job, but the team was built a certain way around Gunnar's talents. I wonder if you had a more high profile quarterback, are you able to attract better receiver talent? I thought Zachariah Branch was incredible. Like I said, but I think he's the only guy on that offense that I would say would have started for the 2021 or 2022 national championship teams.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we talked about what the difference is between Georgia and those two teams playing in last night's game. Scoring defense-wise, Georgia was 10th. This is against and Indiana was 2nd, Miami 5th. So they're all pretty close together, and that kind of gets me into, what do these teams have in common? So you talked about the quarterbacks. I thought Mendoza's run there on the 4th down and 5, he goes that 12-yard run, and he powers his way into the end zone. That did look a lot like Gunnar Stockton to me. And the guy that got his lip bloodied earlier in the game and stayed in there, he's a tough son of a gun. That reminded me a lot of what 14 does for Georgia.
Oh, there's no doubt. It's the differences of the throws and the different levels of throws, and also receivers that get open. And and I thought their running back was better than anybody Georgia had too. I thought he ran harder. I think we saw flashes of that from Nate Frazier down the stretch. Speaking of injuries that cost Georgia, you wonder if maybe if Nate would have been healthy if they beat Ole Miss, right? But there's just not much of a margin for error now. There's just more parity, and I think we'd all gotten used to 21 and 22. Georgia was clearly the supreme teams. And the NFL draft reflected that. We saw 15 players selected off one team. You look at this year's NFL draft, Cody. What do you got? Maybe 7 or 8 dogs being drafted instead of 13 like last year. So kind of wonder about the talent level. You wonder about the level of development. And I said this earlier. I know Indiana went 16-0, and that hadn't been done since the 1800s. Certainly hadn't been done in the modern era. But at the same time, there's so much more parity in college football. I would ask you this. Do you believe Indiana would have beat the Joe Burrow team? Do you believe Indiana would have beat the 21 or 22 Dogs, 2004 USC? I just don't put them in that category. I think they're a very good team, but I just don't think they would have been dynamic enough. I mean, my goodness. Would they have gone undefeated in an SEC schedule? Before you answer that question, consider they almost lost at Iowa, which lost to Iowa State. I mean, Iowa, they had 5 losses. They needed a last-second touchdown to beat Penn State. This team did not just roll through the season. Now, there's a lot to be said for their cohesiveness and Kurt Cignetti, coaching them up and them not making mistakes, being the least penalized team in the nation. But that was not a dynamic national championship team, in my opinion, when we start talking about all-time great teams. I think what they were was the most consistent team in an era of parity.
It's something we can talk about when we get to college football playoff changes. The one thing you can say about this team is they did have to earn it, right? Like they went through Bama, they had to beat Oregon and had to beat Miami on the way. So at least if they're not playing anybody in the regular season, they're going to have to beat some teams on neutral fields, and they did that in those 3 games, down the stretch. So we will credit them for that.
Now, Cody, I'm gonna push back. They didn't play the same Alabama that Georgia saw in September. No more than Georgia did in the SEC championship game. There had been some attrition off that Alabama team. Now, I'm not saying they wouldn't have beat them in September, but Miami. I mean, didn't Louisville and SMU beat Miami? They played Oregon. They played them earlier in the year. It kind of helps when you get a pick 6 on the opening possession. Give them credit. Much more prepared for the Ducks in Atlanta than Dan Lanning's team was. But again, I'm just not. I was not blown away. Carson Beck had an opportunity to beat them in the final minute after Miami gave up 10 points on special teams, which we kind of thought, that the Miami was a little bit flawed. We thought Mark Richt said it, Miami's best game can beat Indiana, right? But Indiana's not going to beat themselves. That's exactly how it played out. But you give Carson Beck that opportunity on that side of the field 10 times, I'm telling you, probably 6 or 7 of them, he's going to score on you.
No, that one wasn't pretty though. And
I will say said that he made the mistake and didn't break off the route.
Should have turned around, and I understand that. I will say I will not compare this year's Indiana team to 2019 LSU or 21 Georgia. That to me, they are not on the same page, and I totally agree with you on that point. That this is a team that I have so much respect for Joe Burrow and that team, what they did, that I do think they would have run up and down the field. So credit to them. I will say a couple other things that I noticed that just look similar, Georgia and Indiana. I thought the Cignetti aggressive play calling reminded me a lot of what Kirby was doing. The fact that they went for it on that 4th and 5, about 6 minutes left, was really, Kirby Smart talked about it post-game, that first Ole Miss game, where he said, they kicked a field goal in that game, and Georgia went up by 6 and then had to hang on for dear life as Ole Miss came back down the field. Well, Kirby said after the game, you know what? The book says actually sometimes you should probably go for that because you only put yourself up 6. They know what they have to do. And so Cignetti, by making that play call, seemed a little aggressive right there. So that reminded me of Kirby a little bit. Of course, a block punt's always going to remind me of what Georgia does, even though that wasn't necessarily a punt block play, but the fact that they scored on special teams reminding me of Kirby Smart teams. It seemed very Saban tree-ish, Cignetti and Kirby right there.
Well, when you've got a quarterback like Fernando Mendoza or Gunnar Stockton that present the dual threat, I think it opens up those 4th down plays. And when we're talking about parity and how close these games are, I mean, You think about Kirby Smart in the post game after the Ole Miss game, and it was gut wrenching to lose. But he sat back and he told us in the days leading up, if you squeeze everything out of your team that you possibly can, that's a good season. And I think Kirby felt like he got everything out of Georgia that he could. Now, could they have won the Ole Miss game? Of course. But like Kirby said, it was like another SEC game. Every SEC game, it seemed like, outside of Kentucky and Alabama in the SEC title game, it was back and forth. I mean, my goodness, they could have, should have, would have lost to Tennessee if Tennessee makes a 41-yard field goal. Could have, should have, would have lost at Auburn. If Auburn punches it in, it goes up 17-0 2 minutes before the half. You wonder what Georgia's comeback attempt would have looked like. Could have, should have, would have. Florida, if TJ Lagway can execute and get a yard and a half there in the final minutes, and the Gators can add to their lead instead of being stopped on fourth down. Ole Miss has a 2-score lead going into the fourth quarter if Josh McCray doesn't give you that second effort and pick up that first down. So, I mean, there'd been a lot of dogfights. This wasn't a Georgia team that just rolled through the season and rolled their helmets out there. I mean, they were only up by what? 2 touchdowns on Austin Peay in the fourth quarter, and they couldn't get in from 1 yard out in the second game of the season. This was a team that grew and got better, but was very young. And, the one thing you did not mention to this point was how old Indiana was.
Right.
And it kind of looked like a semi-pro team. I mean, the average age is, 23, 24 years old. And it kind of looked like in some instances it was boys against men. Now, Miami had some older players too, but there were some plays where Miami receivers Miami secondary defensive backs were not able to get guys down, and it was young guys. They looked like young Ellis Robinson the 4 games he played his freshman year before he redshirted. It's simply not as physically mature, and I think that was a factor for this Indiana football team as well.
Because the margins, you talked about the margins being so thin now and how Georgia's season could have gone one way or the other. We can wrap up our first segment on this. With Georgia being picked top 5, kind of a consensus top 5 for next season, do you feel like the odds are as equal of Georgia making a national championship run as to finishing 18th in that poll at the end of next year? Do you feel like those are equally similar because it's, that close?
I feel a little bit more bullish than that because you don't have a first-year starting quarterback. The fact that Gunnar has had a season under his belt to develop, he will get better. Just as we saw Stetson Bennett grow from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 as a starter, we're going to see a big jump from Gunnar from 1 to 2. If Georgia's done their homework and got the right receiver from Georgia Tech, and if these young freshmen grow as we think they will, Wiley and Taylor, and if we see Elias Williams make a jump and Ethan Barbour in the tight ends room and Lawson Lucky's back, if the running back room can take a step up, Bowens and Frazier, and go from being good to great, this is a team that can win the national championship. You've got 3 starters back on your offensive line. You've recruited well there, though, and you should be better on the offensive line. You took a step up this year. I think you should be even better, and we've already talked about the defense. So I think it's going to be a better Georgia football team next year than this year, but I still think there's going to be a large degree of parity. So I expect to see Georgia win the SEC championship next year. But this is a tournament sport, Cody, and it's not what you do in September, October, November, or December anymore. It's who can get hot late and who's, avoided the key injuries and who gets the good matchups in the playoffs.
You talked about it. It is a tournament sport now. That is for sure. To win the championship, you're going to have to fight your way through a tournament and navigate that. And there could be changes coming to the college football playoff. We're going to talk about that coming up on the show next. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles.
Did you know that Ingles sells a huge variety of organic items? Or that they run their own dairy? Or that they only serve USDA choice and prime meat? Did you know that they have more local craft beer than any place else? Or that they have Energy Smart stores? Or that they professionally slice and package imported cheese from Europe? Did you know about their giant international aisle, local farm partnerships, curbside pickup, wine department? Or that they donate 3,956 meals a day to local food banks? Well, now you do. It's all in the bag. Ingles, low prices, love the savings.
We appreciate Ingles being a part of the program. That never changes for us, but changes could be coming to the college football playoff. Meetings happening last week on Friday, and it seems like it's the Big Ten and it's the SEC, and they're butting heads on what they want. The Big Ten would like to see this thing eventually move to 24 teams in a couple years. SEC says, we can go to 16, but that's it. And these two are clashing. They've been kind of at a standstill for the last year, and they've got to get things done by this Friday, right, Mike? The new deadline that they've set. And if not, we could stick with 12 teams next year, and it'd be very similar. So some changes could or could not be coming, depending on who bends a little bit here.
Yeah, you'd hate to see any money left on the table. Me in this occasion, I'm actually with the Big Ten on this. I'd like to see the playoffs expanded to 24 teams ultimately, and that is the deal. The Big Ten saying, hey, we'll sign off on a 16-team playoff for the next 3 years, provided that the SEC signs off to go to 24 teams after that. And my attitude and approach on it is, hey, if this is a tournament sport, let's make it a tournament sport. If you're going to put this pressure on these college coaches to make the college football playoff or be fired, right now it's 12 out of, I believe, 133 teams, Cody. That's less than 10% of the teams that get in the field versus the NCAA basketball tournament where it's 68 out of about 368, which is better than what? I want to say more than 16, 17%. So I'd like to see a bigger field for that reason. 1, 2, these mid-tier bowl games are dead. And it pains me to say that because I've spent a lot of my career going to different bowl games, whether it was Orlando, Tampa, Nashville, Charlotte, Jacksonville, those mid-tier games that are outside the playoff. There's just no interest. Nobody wants to see it. It's not viewed as a reward. It's viewed as a disappointment. A lot of players opt out. You can't really get a read. There's no significance to those games. They're dying a slow death. If you make those sites playoff sites, you bring life back and you keep more fan bases engaged, you keep more players engaged, and you make it a true playoff. I think Notre Dame had an argument. I'm not saying I thought they should be in, but I think they had an argument. They didn't make the playoff. As it was, the team that played for the national championship and was 41 yards away from winning almost didn't even make the field. In this era of parity, I think you could make a case that you could have more teams that are capable of winning it. I don't know that I would have said that pre-portal 3 or 4 years ago. I think we'd all agree there was probably only 3 or 4 teams that could have won it. Now it's a lot different. So why not open it up? What's the downside of moving the start of the season up a week, taking out the bye week, and getting more teams involved in the playoff? And there's more inventory. It's better for the fans. I think it's better for the players.
Does it kill the SEC championship game to go into 24?
It's already dead. I mean, Georgia's won back-to-back SEC titles, and all I hear is Georgia going to rebound from this season? I mean, to me, that was very special what Kirby did. He's one of only 4 coaches to do it. Philip Fulmer, Steve Spurrier, and Nick Saban are the other 3. The fact that Georgia won back-to-back SEC championships is something that people should celebrate and appreciate, but I don't hear a whole lot of talk about that, Cody. I hear about losing in the Sugar Bowl. I hear people talking about Kirby not winning a playoff game. Well, I've made the case that each of the last 2 years, they've beaten a playoff team in the SEC title game and gotten a bye. Let's be real. Do we think Georgia could have beaten James Madison or Tulane or Texas A&M in a first-round game? I think they could. So I think that's kind of a moot stat because Georgia earned a bye each of the last 2 years. But yeah, unfortunately, I think there's a way you could still play the league title games. It depends on how you do your seeding. You could make that title game worth a first-round playoff bye, depending on how you set the tournament up. I'm not sure that all conferences would be interested in doing that, but if the SEC wants to keep it bad enough, I think there's a way to do it.
When you look at it as well, my thinking about it, the calendar, I agree. The thing I think, the calendar's got to change, right? We can't keep the way it is right now. If you play this again next year, these 2 weeks off here and 2 weeks off there and a week and a half off between this game, and then one game's all of a sudden six days apart is just whack. I think that's got to change for sure. I do think, if you go to the longer thing, the thing that's interesting to me, if you go to a 24-team playoff, you're going to get more teams in. I think this year we had good enough playoff games, minus the JMU game, that, a couple of them were bust right there, right? The Tulane and JMU. So maybe you're adding a couple more of those games, but I thought the other games were good, and I think that is a case for the expanded playoff like we've seen. So I think this is the best year for that we've seen. Really good playoff games throughout the rest of the bracket there, even Alabama getting blown out by Indiana in the Rose Bowl. But I do think if you go to 24 teams, then teams, the Big Ten is very ready to say they're the best conference out there, right? And SEC people will say, well, you hadn't played anybody. And we talked about this with Indiana. At least they had to play somebody to get to the championship game. They couldn't just skate through. If they would have skated through and just been Big Ten champs and moved to the championship game, we would have had a fit with that, right? A couple of years ago, if they would have been in the semifinal, all of a sudden not having played their Big Ten schedule. At least now you're having to move through a couple of ranks. And so to me, if you're the SEC, wouldn't you want the Big Ten to be playing more of these games and maybe have to face another SEC team or two to really even out this schedule? Do you get what I'm saying there? Would that make more sense for the SEC to want more of a playoff because that's when you get to flex your muscle that you've got better teams?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think that it's a matter of, the SEC being comfortable with 16 teams, thinking that that's the right number. They would still get 5 teams in potentially. Going to 16, you go to 24. I don't know how many more teams you get in, especially now that you're playing this 9-game schedule. This is going to be another loss for half the teams in the league. And, the thing that's a little upsetting about it, to me, is that the SEC made that move at the request of the Big Ten, and it's almost like a bait and switch. It almost felt like the Big Ten was saying, hey, if you go to a 9-game schedule, we'll consider a 16-team playoff. And so the SEC did that, and the Big Ten said, oh, yeah, we'll consider it. But, oh, by the way, we want it to go to 24 3 years later. And, if you're the SEC, it feels like that you've already gone out of your way once for the Big Ten, and now it feels like you're being maybe manipulated. So I think there's a bit of a power struggle going on here as far as, what's realistic and what makes the most sense. I think the Big Ten model does in 3 years. Let's face it, we're advancing towards 2 super conferences. Nobody wants to go there, Cody. But here's the thing. We're already there. We're already seeing a professional model. We're already seeing free agency. We're already seeing players get paid. We're already seeing the regular season relegated by a playoff. We're already seeing not quite the same number of firings as the NFL, but I believe there's over 30 coaching changes in the FBS ranks, and I want to say 17 of them were in the Power 4 ranks. I mean, that's almost 25% of the Power 4 coaches that got fired, 1 out of every 4. Over 10,000 players in the portal. So this thought that we're holding on to college football, it's not happening. I mean, the genie's out of the bottle, or the toothpaste is out of the tube, however you want to say it. So I think you need to complete the process and make this as close to the NFL as you can. And I don't think you're going to get any sort of standardization until you get a collective bargaining agreement and turn the student athletes in the revenue sports, at least, into employees. And I'd say we're years off from that, the way the court system works.
Yeah, we'll agree with you. It does feel like the Big Ten moved the goalpost on the SEC. And now this 9-game thing, especially with the Big Ten now having won back-to-back-to-back national championships. SEC was already having a tough time making the case for our league's so tough and you have to excuse a loss or two. And now you're going to add another loss and try and argue your way into a resume spot, just based off wins and losses. It makes it harder for the SEC. Totally agree with that. And when it comes to an NFL model, what I wouldn't mind is, if it is the SEC and it's the Big Ten, we'll send you our best. Y'all send you your best. So figure out your own tournaments, and then we'll just send one to meet in the Super Bowl. That's what they do in the AFC and the NFC, right? You have your own conference championships. Now, granted, it's the exact same for both. But I'm going to say we'll figure out our champion, y'all figure out y'all's champion, and we'll meet in the national championship game. How would you feel about something like that?
Yeah, well, certainly how you determine the playoff teams that you send, if there is a certain allocation from every conference. One thing I would add here, Cody, talking about a tournament sport, and I do some Big Ten programming and still have a lot of connections from, when I went to school up there and some of the media that I've done up there. They get real quiet when you remind them that there hasn't been a Big Ten basketball team that's won the national championship since 2000. And I would tell you that year in and year out, the Big Ten is, if not the best conference in college basketball, top to bottom, one of the best. And yet they haven't won a national title since 2000 with the Purdues and the Michigan States and the Michigans and the Wisconsins, basketball blue bloods, powerhouses. And yet come tournament time, they're a little beat up. As Kirby Smart talks about, there's a mental bandwidth involved. When you've weathered a season like that, where in the Big Ten, every arena feels like it's full. There's a different level of intensity than I've seen top to bottom than we've seen in the SEC. And yet, if you go back to 2000, I believe there's been 3 Florida national championships and a Kentucky national title, Cody. So now that we've turned this into a tournament sport, I do think that you have to consider that it isn't always reflective of the regular season or the conference strength. I mean, my goodness, Carson Beck was 45 yards away from making the ACC the championship conference. And I don't think anybody would have made the argument that that was the best conference in college football.
A very good point right there. All right, well, let's move on and talk about it. It's something it's had you riled up on Twitter, at least, or X, all day long, last day or so. Carson Beck throws the interception late in that game. Georgia fans everywhere, I guess the term is schadenfreude, right? You go to the German, they love to see somebody else's misery. A lot of Georgia fans, and we talked about it a lot on the program last week, wanted to see Carson Beck fail, and the way he does, throwing an interception, something that reminds a lot of Dog fans of 2024. And they all had something to say, a little petty out there today, and you have not been a big fan of that.
I don't think it's a good look for Georgia, and I've covered the SEC a long time, and I've covered Georgia from other angles when I was the Alabama beat writer, the Auburn beat writer, the Tennessee beat writer, even Michigan State for that matter. And the thing that I always thought about Georgia fans, and still do, is it's very classy. It's a very classy institution, whether you're talking about the academics there, whether you're talking about the fans on game day, Sanford Stadium itself. The town of Athens is amazing. The campus is beautiful. It's just not like Georgia fans to be that petty. I think about Jalen Hurts, Cody. You don't hear the Alabama fans dog cussing Jalen Hurts, and you didn't when he went to Oklahoma to transfer. And they still consider him a former Alabama quarterback. Now, maybe it would have been different if Carson hadn't been the one to beat Ole Miss when Gunnar Stockton wasn't able to. Maybe that created some sort of envy, but it shouldn't. I looked at it as a win-win. When you look at the fact that it wasn't so long ago, 3 years ago, we were all celebrating Carson Beck. What was he, the only top 10 quarterback in the nation who hadn't started the first 3 years that didn't transfer? He could have left Georgia long ago when he didn't get his shot, when Stetson Bennett beat him out. But he stayed true to Georgia. He stayed and he developed. Now, he quickly turned into the poster child for NIL when he posted a picture of the Lamborghini that he bought. He didn't get very good counsel or advisement there, and perception overtook reality. He put too much out there on social media. Now, I can tell you there's a lot of football players, basketball players, media members that are doing things off camera that you wouldn't feel real good about, but they don't broadcast it. And so Carson kind of did it to himself. If he would have beaten Alabama in the SEC title game his first year as a starter, I mean, you realize the guy went 12-0 in the regular season, and Georgia was the first team since the league went into divisions to have 3 undefeated regular seasons, and Carson Beck was that third quarterback. If they beat Alabama, if Brock Bowers is 100%, we're not having these conversations. If Georgia's receivers don't lead the nation in drop passes, if they don't make that ridiculous Hail Mary call and expose him to that kind of hit at the end of the half. And don't forget, he almost got hurt on the same play earlier in the year. If that doesn't happen, then maybe it's a different narrative. And as it turned out, Carson got a chance to go somewhere else, get a fresh start, play well, improve his draft stock. And Georgia got an opportunity to play another guy that had waited 3 years for his opportunity and didn't transfer. And I think we'd all agree that Gunnar Stockton seized the reins and made the most of it. Gunnar had an incredible season. Gunnar finished in the top 10 in the Heisman Trophy voting. Carson Beck didn't. There's nothing to be ashamed of, jealous of. I mean, this was a natural evolution for Georgia football, for Gunnar Stockton, the more mobile quarterback, to take over, and he'll be back for another year. Carson Beck got to go to Miami, lead another team to a national title game appearance, improve his draft stock. I don't think anybody has to hate on anybody. I think you can like both. Just like Georgia fans support Mark Richt. He left Georgia and went to Miami too, but I didn't hear near the vitriol, and that was because the perception of the situation was different.
Yeah, I think there are definitely some Georgia fans who are on your side. I saw the support coming in on Twitter as well, and I think a lot of Dog fans feel that way. And again, if it's a decision you personally have to make, right? Do you want to? To me, it is a little tacky to put it out there, ha ha ha, laughing at somebody else's failure. The same way I don't, you don't clap when somebody misses a putt in golf. Like it's just not something that I would do. I can understand that Dog fans were tired of the narrative that ESPN was putting out there, but as we put on the broadcast last week, Carson, at least to us, said all the right things. So hard to be upset about that. And I do think the other thing that folks were, he walked off the field without shaking hands. Well, we showed the video. Gunner was going to do the same thing 2 weeks ago at the Sugar Bowl after they lost because he was upset that they lost. So that doesn't do anything for me either. So anyway, that's our Carson Beck moment for the day, and that'll be the last time. Why we talk about him for a long, long time, but it was just interesting out there watching Georgia fans react last night.
I mean, he's a Georgia guy, Cody. I mean, the final point I would make is this is a guy that gave 5 years of his life to Georgia, that graduated from the University of Georgia. And to me, he's kind of built by Kirby Smart and built by Georgia. I mean, he didn't learn all those things that led Miami to a national title game in the final possession with a chance to win by accident. He had to grow into that. Remember, he wasn't ready for his time at Georgia, and that's why Stetson Bennett took over, and he had to sit and wait another 2 years and learn to be a better quarterback and learn to be a better leader. No, he was not a finished product when he left Georgia. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, Carson says, I'll always be a Bulldog. His graduate degree says University of Georgia. And I just wonder, of the people that are out there criticizing them, what have they done for the University of Georgia to help the football program compared to the investment that Carson Beck made?
All right, we'll leave it right there. Appreciate it, Mike. Want to remind you all, please like and subscribe our DawgNation YouTube channel as we go throughout the months here. We're kind of off. You're going to get off your normal football viewing schedule and all of that. Mike will be down at the Senior Bowl with Kaylee Mansell. We're going to be all over the place. We just put up 2 interviews with Georgia early enrollees on our YouTube channel yesterday. You can check those out there. So like and subscribe to our DawgNation YouTube channel so you're up to date on everything that we're putting out there. Same thing with DawgNation.com. Mike with great stuff on the early polls that are out, all of that kind of stuff. Be sure to check in DawgNation.com as well. All right, we're going to wrap it up, and we've had great coverage of our DawgNation basketball team, or Georgia basketball team, on DawgNation.com. The Dogs go take down a top 25 team in number 17 Arkansas on Saturday, a game where they got out big and then fended off some runs from Arkansas and then beat the Hogs at the end of the day 90-76. They got a game coming up tonight against Missouri. They'll be at Texas on Saturday. This is a team right now, Mike, that in the bracketology says they're an 8 seed.
I mean, you woke up one day at the end of January and Georgia was ranked ahead of North Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee, as well as Louisville, Auburn, Wisconsin, UCLA. I mean, Georgia basketball now, Cody, this is 6 weeks in a row that Mike White's team has been ranked in the top 25, and they've earned it. When they lost to Ole Miss on the last-second shot in overtime in a game they probably should have won, you had to wonder if this team was going to fade. We've seen it happen before. After that game, Jeremiah Wilkinson said, "This is just 1 out of 14 games. We've got to move on from this." Moments later, Mike White said, "I want this to resonate. I want these guys to feel it." And I had to tell Coach White, I don't know how much Jeremiah Wilkinson's really feeling it, Coach. Kind of sounds like he's ready to move on to the next one. And you could tell that Mike White kind of struggled for a second because he said, well, that's good that he's confident, but we're going to have to ask him to do more on defense. He said it in a very nice way. Guess what? Wilkinson led the team with 5 steals against Arkansas, still put up 20, and they pull away from the win. So there's something to be said for the resiliency and the confidence and the chemistry of this team. Now that you see Blue Kane back involved, he had some big moments down the stretch against the number 17 ranked Arkansas team coached by John Calipari. Georgia leads the nation in scoring. We said, yeah, that's because of the schedule. Arkansas was number 2 in fast break points. Georgia outran the Hogs. Mike White outcoached John Calipari. Stegman Coliseum was a difference maker. This is an NCAA tournament bound team as we sit here right now. You got to keep everybody healthy. You got to keep the chemistry going. You got to go on the road to Missouri and Texas. You got to try to steal one of these 2 games. But this Georgia team is taking care of business, Cody, and I'm telling you, they're worth watching. It's a lot of fun. There's a good chemistry. And now Georgia basketball, a fixture in the college basketball AP Top 25 poll 6 weeks in a row, the longest stint since Jim Herrick was head coach in 2003.
Yeah, this is one of those things we used to get to the offseason in football and you're just like, black hole until, maybe some baseball could do something just to make us smile for a week. But boy, to have basketball up there inconsistently, I think that's the thing. It's like, you'd expect maybe Georgia can make a blip on the top 25 and then they'll lose and that'll be that. But this is a team that at least so far has stuck around. Going to be tough this week with 2 road tests. So you feel like if they can steal one, that's a success?
Yeah, you look at their net ranking, and the net ranking is the computer ranking. It's kind of like the old RPI. They call it the net now. And Georgia's number 27. They had all those schools that I just mentioned. So their computer ranking could be better, by the way. I picked on their schedule a little bit earlier this year, but it's not Georgia's fault that Georgia Tech stinks in basketball. It's not Georgia's fault that Cincinnati's not having a great year. And it is fortunate for Georgia. One of their 3 losses came to Clemson. Hey, that's a top 20 team. So you pay attention to some of the teams that Georgia's already played in that computer metric. And provided Cincinnati rounds into form and Georgia Tech starts winning a few games, that's going to help Georgia out in these computer metrics. Big thing, though, if the Dogs can finish over 500 in the SEC, they'll be locked into another NCAA tournament berth for the 2nd year in a row.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to that. How much fun is that, Georgia basketball back on the map? All right, we're going to leave it there for this week. We'll have plenty more coming up next week. Maybe we'll see some college football playoff changes. We'll talk about that, and we have a lot to get to this offseason. And we'll have the Senior Bowl coming up in very short time as well. All right, that's going to wrap up for On the Beat this week. We'll see you back here on our normal Monday slot next Monday on the Beat.